So, Brandon, I wanted to ask you a pretty out there question straight away, and I wanted to talk to you about what is potentially the scariest moment that you've had commercializing any cardiovascular company right now.
Sure. Well, first off, Jordan, thanks for having me on the show. I think the scariest moment was realization that we had 3 months of cash left and we had to do something fast. So, anytime you are running out of cash and you have an entire company depending on what your next move is, that certainly brings out a lot of scariness.
And how long had you been at the business when you found out about how much money you had and how much runway you had?
It was about 9 months, which, then I learned to ask different questions as we went into other ventures for sure. But, yeah, there was funding taking place, or there was a plan B, if you will, and a few other things that were happening. But just the realization that something could go so quickly and, what the ramifications of that were. So that's definitely a scary part. The other thing that's always scary early in a commercialization is, you know, when you've got to pivot and have reorgs, rifts, layoffs, whatever you want to call them, because these people leave stable companies to come to startups, and that's the last thing you want to be doing.
And how does how would you react to that as a CCO? What's your first port of call there?
Uh, well, you find out how you can cut other ways. Like, is it through budgets? What are our other options? Is there, if there's poor performing folks, then you can look at who's on a PIP, things like that. Then, at least those people, if you're on a PIP or you've been not hitting your number for a long time, and then you have to see something's coming. But you do what you can to try to avoid it, but then you just got to be honest and upfront and transparent with the folks and say, look, whenever I interview people to come to startups, I always say, look, we could be acquired in a month, we could be bankrupt in a month, right? Or hopefully longer than that. But there's one of two probable exits. And so, we just go with that. And you're just very transparent upfront. Like with Atraverse, one of the things that when we would interview folks is say, look, there's a strong possibility we're going to be acquired soon. We don't know when, but we've been having lots of conversations and just very upfront with folks.
And soon it did happen as well. It's something that we can touch on in a little bit in this episode. I guess firstly, what I'd like to do is actually dive into your background. I didn't quite realize the extent that you've had in cardiovascular. It'd be good to understand, what originally drew you into the space and what those early days looked like.
Sure. So I got into medtech completely by accident. I was a college golfer, played on some mini tours, and ended up at a uh, tech startup for basically selling software and services, and was upset with my boss at the time and literally applied to Pfizer online, and I should have bought a lottery ticket instead. 2 weeks later, I was hired by Pfizer to begin my career. I was calling on cardiologists at the time, and a lot of the cardiologists I called on, I developed a good relationship with. And when Guidant was looking for another rep, they said, "Oh, you need to talk to this guy, Brandon." And so, literally, that's how I got into it. So, from Guidant, I moved. We were obviously acquired by Boston Scientific. Was there for many years. Then came out to Florida. That was in the West Coast, Phoenix, and then came to Biosense Webster in Tampa. And I've been in Tampa since. And I went from Biosense Webster to Acutus to Atraverse, and did some consulting along the way as well.
And you've worked with some pretty incredible brands over the years. Uh, you know, I kind of want to talk to you a little bit about the guidance type. There's a bit of fog on there about the acquisition in its early days, and talk to me about that early acquisition. So that was your first step into the cardiovascular space, and you was bought up pretty quickly by Boston Scientific. What did that look like?
It was very unique. So we had communications from Johnson and Johnson where they literally brought us all into um, Minneapolis. J&J came out and actually was walking us through what our benefits would be for ourselves and our field members. what the pension was like, I mean, everything down to how they had pet insurance. I mean, it was wild. And then follow up a month later, we were Boston Scientific.
And how does it feel going from what was the sort of headcount of Guidant when you was bought?
It was large. I mean, it was, I think you have to check me on this number, but I think it was like a $27 billion acquisition. I mean, it was a huge acquisition. I was a small cog in the wheel there as just a business director. But I mean, it was a large number, and it was two companies that clearly did not get along, did not like each other, and they got into a bidding war. And I think the Wall Street Journal and a bunch of other financial rags that J&J ended up winning that one. That it was a well overpaid position.
And then so, yeah, I can imagine they did feel that way as well. And okay, cool. So you took a little bit of a pivot out as well. So I noticed that at some point you also went to Intuitive to a little bit as well. What was it like switching from a company like Boston to Intuitive?
And so I went to Intuitive in the early days where they were really doing a lot of robotic surgery. I went to an individual contributor role. There was some things that was going on in my life where I was just like, maybe I want to get out of EP. I want to get out of the CRM space because it's 24/7. You're on call. It was a lot. Um, and I just wanted for a change. And what I realized when I went to Intuitive, great technology, was fun. I was bored. The CRM EP lifestyle is just very fast. You have to know your stuff really well. I remember one of my mentors at Intuitive was like, "Yeah, these general surgeons are really hard." And I talked to him, and I'm like, "Oh my god, you have never met an EP." So yeah, it worked out. My dad was having some health issues in Port Charlotte, so they live in Florida. And I had been talking to Biosense Webster out in the Arizona market, and the gentleman there, Jeff Hopkins, was like, "Oh, you know what? I don't have a spot here." We ended up taking an internal candidate, but it's not my area, but I think you'd be great for us. I know you have family in Florida. Would you talk to our guys out in Tampa? And the rest is history. Came out to Tampa. It was me and I think 3 clinicals. We did about $3 million worth of business. Fast forward, before I left, it was 40 plus. We were doing $40 million. Um, and I'd had several reps underneath me too. We just grew it immensely for sure. Great market, great company. Um, Learned a lot there. And then, ironically, was recruited out to Acutus with some folks I used to work with at Guidant, and was able to be involved with taking that company public. So I actually helped deliver the test the water calls and was sort of the incumbent EP expert for that as the VP of sales, and I got to talk to all the analysts and investors and really go hand in hand with our CEO, which was awesome. Great experience there. Unfortunately, that fell apart. COVID really affected us a lot. And then did some consulting with Atraverse along with a few other companies, and hit it off with John Slump, who's sold 4 companies now. I'm sure he's going to be working on his 5th real soon. And Atraverse just it was a rocket ship. I mean, we had product approval and sold the company in like 3.5 years.
And I think that you just mentioned that there, John and Steve, they're household names in EP now. Everyone knows them guys. They've achieved some incredible stuff. I just wanted to actually bring it back a step. So yeah, I noticed when I looked through your page, and you spent 7.5 years at Biosense Webster, and achieved some incredible stuff. And you mentioned there that you learned some lessons on the way, and what were those lessons that you learned that then scaled you into the person that you are?
Yeah, so when you're in a geography, like I was in Phoenix and sort of covered the West Coast with Guidant in various roles, and completely uprooting myself and bringing to Tampa, where I literally knew no one, didn't know anything, and you have that, or at least I did. I had that, oh my god, that imposter syndrome. Like, uh oh, I'm gonna fail. or I need to figure it out. What if the things that worked out there don't work out here? But they did. So I was fortunate. And those things I'm talking about is just, being real with folks, being authentic, but also selling the value of your product, but also where you come short. One of the things that we did at Guidant when we had all our recalls, my area was able to maintain its market share by just being upfront and honest with the physicians on what's going on. So really learning that, and that's where I really had to learn delegation because we had so many people and it kept growing so fast. Um, you're really surrounding yourself with good people. And, a mistake that I think we all make, um, even today, is, you hire somebody and you want them to work out so well when you see the writing on the wall that they're not the right person. And that's a tough pill to swallow. I've always taken that a little too personally, like maybe it was a failure of mine where I didn't mentor them well enough or coach them well enough. But sometimes you just have to realize that it might not just be you.
Yeah, and I think especially in the commercial world, it can be seen as such a cutthroat market, right? It's feast or famine. So the fact that you take that personally just shows that you care about the team and you care about results, and sometimes they go hand in hand, and those difficult decisions do happen. So, at least you care about them. That is the main thing. I think people that don't are often the leaders that don't get looked towards. Um, One thing I did find quite interesting is, you went from Biosense Webster into Acutus, and things were great and also quite hard at the same time. How did it feel then making that next decision to join, the company you did? So Atraverse, we're still pretty early into the market, stepping into risky territory again. There must have been maybe a few months of de-risking it in your mind and thinking about it.
100%. So I actually met John. I was interviewing for Volta, where he was CFO at the time, for their VP of sales. And Jeff Martin, who's still over there at Volta, is a good friend of mine. We worked together at Biosense and Acutus. But anyways, long story short, there with John, I was interviewing for that. They went another way. They had somebody already consulting for them and moved. But John and I stayed in contact, got me involved early with consulting. And I think the first or second day of my consulting with them, we did an animal lab. The first animal lab where they were actually trying out the product. And to say it did not go as planned is putting it mildly. So, um, and I was literally on a Zoom call similar to this, watching it happen, and it was obvious it was on a pig model. So as it's happening, I'm like, yeah, we need to be crossing in milliseconds, not seconds. And there was a few other things, but the end product that was put out by Atraverse is second to none. It's amazing with the auto off, the rail stiffness of the wire. So Eric Sauter, Dr. Steve, John, the whole crew did amazing putting that all together. And I got to sell it, so that was even better.
Okay, I love that. And, when you first saw them then, what made you think, this device could be commercially meaningful in this market? It's one of the biggest buzzwords, right? EP. So people need to stand out there. There must have been something that you saw immediately that was like, I want that.
You look at the team. I mean, Dr. Steve and John have, they did Farapulse. You dig into John, we talked about earlier. He's sold a couple other companies. So, four, now four, but at that time was three. And I was talking to a couple buddies, and we may or may not have had a few bourbons, and we're talking about just life in general. What do we want to do? And when do you take risk, when you don't, when you get to a certain age. And they're like, you look for history, even though that old y- past success doesn't predict future results. Every time you look at the stock market, right? Um, in this space, it does because the strategics look at these folks, investors look at these folks, and yeah, I was just at a point in time of life, and I was like, you know what? Let's make it work, and I'm glad I did. I mean, I learned a lot. Um, my experience at Acutus was all about venture capital and the big, OrbiMed, the large. VCs. And with Atraverse, it was all about family offices and high net worth individuals, and very different, uh, um, very different individuals for sure. But I actually think I like the family offices and the high net individuals. It's more personalized. They feel more of a, obviously my own opinion, but they feel more connected with the company, and you have to tell a story, and they have to really appreciate that story and believe that you're the ones that can bring it over the line. And I was very fortunate that John allowed me in, and actually I did a lot of the investor calls with him, and was able to present on a number of them, and really learned a ton.
And just how many exit have you been a part of now?
I've got 2 exits, about 370 million in exits. Hopefully for a couple more. I've got some early consulting in on a couple other companies. Uh, Trying to figure out what my next step is, but the outreach has been fairly large since the J&J exit was announced. So I'm launching a consulting company, kind of do it full time with a couple other folks. So, commercialization, ASCs, the normal things that companies are looking for. How do we get there?
Okay, very, very nice. And I kind of want to dig deeper on what you mentioned there previously about the venture capital space and the family office space. As everyone knows right now, the fundraising market is tough, and I think in particular, if you don't have differentiated technology, it's even tougher. How did you find the difference on a scale of things working with venture capital raising and working with family offices?
Well, venture capital, what was odd at Atraverse is venture capitals, the bigger groups were knocking on our door on the regular, trying to write one large check and take a big chunk of what was going on. But as I've learned is, you get a big VC come in, they take over, they want a spot on the board, they want preferential treatment to, the first in money, et cetera. Whereas I think family offices are much more like everybody needs to eat. We don't need to screw the first money in. We want to make sure that, everybody gets a good return. And VC in my mind, that valuable if you need to raise a ton of money. Um, but you don't necessarily always need to raise, 400 million. You can raise 50 million. John was able to do that at Atraverse without VC. And he's been very successful at that. Um, and just my experience is that model, if you need, I don't know, probably 40 or less, or 50 or less is probably a good model, but you're going to work a hell of a lot more for it, but you're giving up a lot less, because you're going to have 100 plus shareholders versus two.
Okay. And do you think the kind of raising companies are doing now, do you think this might affect your decision on where you go next? Is it something that you thought about?
It actually has. It actually has. I sort of really enjoy the investor relation portion of it from the family office because you get to know these folks. John was always great at bringing the investors in on inviting them to things like for HRS or Heart Rhythm Society or Boston AFib. We'd have like a little get together with them, and a lot would come because they'd already there looking for their next investments. And so you get to personally meet them and know what's going on. And actually, one of them, really surprised, actually just sent a really nice bottle of wine to thank me for uh, the Atraverse closing. Also, I think he also sent one to John as well, but we had that relationship because John and I were always on these calls with him, giving him updates and everything else. And I think that's, one of the things that is nice with the family office is, you can do quarterly updates and it doesn't feel like you're annoying them, right? They want to know what's going on because it felt like they were much more invested, not only with their money, but just emotionally.
I mean, I think, VC right now is tough. It feels like people believe they're moving the goalposts a bit. They want to see earlier clinical data. They want to see more clinical data, especially first in human. They even want to see more early traction in commercialization. So it's making me think now. Do you think stories like Atraverse are actually going to convince more cardiovascular companies to avoid going down the traditional VC route for longer and maybe look at this approach of accessing family office capital more?
I mean, I think so. And I think there's a market for it, right? Because you've got a lot of these family offices bumping up. I mean, clearly, Facebook and Instagram are seeing that I've been looking at family offices because now it's like all these other ones that are popping up on my feed saying, "Hey, are you looking for a family office? Have you thought about this one?" And fractional family offices rolling up. So I think there's a market for it for sure. I think where founders fall short is they're stuck in that mind that they don't think they have the time to raise from that many individuals, and it's just easier to go to VC. And I would say with the amount of stuff they have to put in the VDR and everything else, it's to me personally, I would stick with a family office as long as you can
Cool.
because you
And
maintain more control.
yeah, that does make sense. And what are the other pros and cons of this then? So like you mentioned there, a lot of stakeholders, people will look at and think that's something daunting, but maybe it's not so much as they think. What are the other sort of conflictions people look at when it comes to VC versus family office?
I mean, I think family office, you definitely have a lot more touch points. It's a lot more, um, a lot more collaboration, because you'll have these groups. They'll make one person the head of this project or the Atraverse in this case. They'll be head of that project, but there may be 27 people within that. We're only counting them as one uh, um, investor because they're investing in an SPV, but it's still more than that. So there's a lot of calls that you have to do, and you can't get all of 27 on one call. So then you're doing multiple calls, and you know, um, it's a lot in addition to what you have to do every day. So you just lose some sleep for a while as you're raising money. But I think if you have the stomach for it or the endurance, I guess is a better way to do it. I think that's the better way to go. VC, you get 3, 4 VC online, they write you the check, but then, they're wanting a lot more for it. They want the board seats, they want control.
Okay. And one of the things that VCs are looking at is commercial playbook, and that's something I want to talk to you about. You've built some incredible teams in your career in different areas of the cardiovascular space as well. Um, you know, do you have a playbook? Is there something that Brandon comes in and tries to initiate from day one?
So, yes and no. I mean, my playbook is people, right? You have to have great people. I've been fortunate that I've had dozens of folks follow me from company to company. And, I mean, it's been nice. You've good people, but you also hold them accountable and they have to trust you, right? So I am I think an anomaly from what I'm hearing and what I'm finding out there is I'm in the trenches with my folks. So I'm credentialed at the hospitals. I go in and I cover cases with them. I did at Atraverse, launch accounts, and very similar at Acutus, um, where I want to know what the true obstacles are. How are we going to get around them? And so when your folks see you in the field with them, figuring it out and getting your butt handed to you too, just like they are, versus being in an ivory tower. I think that's part of the reason why I think people follow to different companies because they know that you're going to be successful. I mean, the Biosense run that I had, we had 3 Presidents Clubs in 8 years. And that's number one in the country as reps and as manager. And I had an area of the country that hadn't hit their number in 15 years prior to me getting there. So that wasn't me. That was a great team, and we were able to build a strong team. But it's also empowering your team, but also developing them. So we would do a lot of times in commercial when you're launching, I can't hire the $8 billion rep that has all these relationships because number one, they're going to have a non compete and they're going to require a lot of dollars. So I can bring a clinical in that has sales aptitude that maybe just hasn't done it yet. So they have that acumen. They you see that raw skill, And so I bring them in and I teach them. And then that just really develops a lot of loyalty both ways, but you get to watch them grow. And I think that's probably we talked about the exits, we talked about the President's Club. My most exciting things I get really jazzed about is, watching these clinicals that are now sales reps closing their sales. And the first sale, we just had one with Acutus or Atraverse rather, where I, I had left the company, and it closed like 3 days after I left, and he's like, "I'm so sad this didn't close while you're here, but I wanna share this with you. This is great." And he was just the excitement. I'm like, "This is what it's all about, right?" You've gotta develop your people. So the playbook is you feature benefit, but develop your people, make them good, but be alongside them to do it, to figure out what's really going on.
And in terms of, I could ask you about other areas, but I think with the fact that your most recent roles have been in EP, what does early adoption really look like in EP? You mentioned that you've been in the trenches. How do you actually, get things moving in that space?
So you've got to, to me, you've got to go to the podium presence, the key opinion leaders, and then I've always sort of looked at where those folks are, and then where their disciples were, who did their fellowship with them, and where are they at, and then try to lock those folks in as well. Um, like Acutus, we looked at folks that were big users of Chilpera, right, because they believed that there was a deficiency in the current mapping system back then, and I would argue today, where there needs to be something else. So that's where you've got a Volta and a Vector Medical and I think a Rhythm AI trying to deliver where's a place to deliver that PFA therapy. Everyone's excited about PFA therapy. You're just doing the same thing they did before, faster, but you're not changing the basics of a anatomic ablation.
I want to take a minute to say thank you to our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical device development. With deep scientific and engineering expertise, they help medtech teams crack tough development challenges and make the right calls early, reducing rework, delays, and uncertainty later on. Whether you're navigating uncharted technical territory or racing towards market, TTP brings clarity and real-world judgment to the decisions that shape performance, usability, and manufacturability. By retiring risk early and grounding innovation in real-world constraints, they help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes.
And what has to happen for a physician to move from, generally trying a product to routinely using it?
You have to have that aha moment, right? So if you're going in for a one case trial, you have to sell the fact that you need one, there's a learning curve, and two, you have to do a number of cases to see that aha moment, right? And anything, especially if you're looking like a PVC or whatever, it was the product was so good at Acute or at Atraverse, we were able to show it very quickly because obviously it wasn't a large learning curve. Bayless did a lot of the heavy lifting for us in terms of education of why RF guide wires are the way to go for your transeptals, right? Easier placement with the larger bore sheaths and manipulation in the atrium. You need the right stick specifically for placing like the Watchmans of the world or the amulets. So that part was we were able to piggyback off of that. So we basically sold like everything you love about the Bayless we give you, and we engineered out all the stuff you didn't like. And we changed the wire's not the same. The generator's not the same. The generator has an auto off feature. So as soon as you cross it was automatically off, which the docs fell in love with that because the Bayless system is preset to either 1, 2, or 3 seconds. So we found out where their gaps were in the physician's workflow and just drove that point home. And once they saw it and really felt it and enjoyed it, it stopped. Sort of like back in the day with Biosense when did the Shed the Lead campaign, right? Because I don't know if you've ever wore lead an entire day in a case in the lab. It's heavy. Yeah, it may only be 3 or 5 pounds, but over the course of an entire day, it's a lot. And that first time you got the doc to remove that lead and they were all on ice, they look at you and say, thank you. I mean, because you just feel so much better at the end of the day. And then the staff turns around and says, thank you, because they're not in lead either. So, I mean, you just have to find that aha moment and just things are missing, drive it home. I mean, it's not rocket science for sure. If I'm doing it, it's definitely not rocket science.
Oh, I think the thing you've just touched on as well, is I think a lot of companies' thesis these days is, improving workflow. But, when you're speaking with some of these physicians, they've probably done thousands of transeptal punctures. What do you think was the main aha moment for them? What was the biggest point that was ultimately consistently, convincing these physicians to make these changes in their workflow?
I think, one, I think the auto off feature was big, but when they're doing a transeptal and they have to do the exchange, we let them go choose whatever therapeutic they wanted to.
Hmm.
We were sheath agnostic. We didn't care. We had different wires for it. And they'd go up and it's a one-time thing, boom, and they could go. And if with the increase in concomitant procedures, the stiffness of the wire allowed them to use as an exchange for the Watchman delivery system or the amulet delivery system. So it just made it easier. Um, so it's just filling a need that they had. I mean, I'd love to say it's more than that. It wasn't rocket science what we were doing. It was very easy. And I think the biggest miss in a lot of these companies, and we had it at Acutus too early on, is you have a lot of the R&D and engineers have never been in the case. So they're building a system for an engineer, not the physicians that are using it. And so early and often we got our folks out in the field doing cases and seeing workflows. And they're like, oh, I can see where this really would benefit. And oh, we need to change this because of this. I think, and I'm consulting with, a couple companies now. And the thing I'm saying is, talking to some engineers, been designing a product for years, has never seen a case.
Which is strange, really, if you think about it. It's hard to put into perspective. You'd think like a Formula One engineer has been like loving cars all life and going to watch races. To find someone that hasn't been, it's very unique, right? It's something that's almost you couldn't fathom.
It's wild. It makes zero sense to me. And so, and like I said, I'm probably the least common denominator on a lot of this stuff. And so I'm like, hey, have your engineers seen cases yet? They're like, oh, that's a good question. I'm like, whoa, no, that's not a good question. That's the question, right? Because you can't develop something that's going to take longer. It may be the better product, but if it's adding 20 minutes to the procedure, you're dead. It's not going to work.
There's another commercial. Well, not I say that I've just got my words jumbled. There's another pitfall that I think founders do make, and we've spoke about this previously as well. And it's believing they don't need sales reps until they really need to start selling. And I know that you've got a bit of passion about this, and that you've got some very good answers for this. Why do you think it is usually too late for them?
Well, they all think that they get through the process. They're now at a point where, okay, we're approved or we're about to get approved. All right. So as soon as we get approved, we're going to hire somebody. Okay. Well, they forget that you've got to train the folks. You've got to find the folks, right? Because in the EP space right now, Medtronic, Biosense, and Abbott, it's an arms race for clinicals right now, right? And good time to be a clinical or mapper there is they're making more money than the sales reps in some cases. But with the sales reps, they have to know their product, right? You have to be able to differentiate, but the EP is a very savvy user and they're going to ask very detailed questions. These guys are very cerebral. These ladies are also they know exactly what they want. They want to know that you have the ability to talk the talk with them. And you're going to have folks that come out, they've got non-competes, so maybe they have to go to areas that they're not there. But it's also a 90 to 180 day from when they get through VAC process and actually start delivering revenue. And so I think in the interest of trying to preserve money, they're not hiring salespeople fast enough. And I've seen a couple times where they've taken a rep who's only sort of been an individual contributor, but might have had a couple folks underneath them and say, okay, you're area sales manager or you're VP of sales, whatever the case may be. And they're just not out of their depth. And I would say the commercial hire, your first commercial hire is paramount to your success.
Let's talk about that. I think that's a really interesting comment you've made there. What does a great first commercial hire look like in that space?
Well, to me, and what I've done to try to be successful, and there's far better than I, but the little things like if I'm going to manage, if you've got somebody that's going to manage from a spreadsheet, not really have any relationships with customers around the country, and not really be able to move the needle by themselves, you got the wrong person. What I try to do is I have relationships around the US. I'm in the cases, I'm at the cases, I'm invested with them, I'm with the folks front line to one, understand where the benefits are of the product, but also where the deficiencies are. And then bringing that back to our engineers and be like, hey, there's some things we need to do here, 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 or whatever the case may be. This might be some feedback that we've gotten from the physicians, and then doing this crazy thing sometimes is grabbing those engineers and dragging them with me to these cases, right? And say, this is what I'm talking about. This is why you can't have this here because it's in the middle of the work field. So I think when you have a commercial lead that not only has relationships but can pull those through, but also has done this before and seen it before, can build backpacks, meaning whatever you're submitting to the value analysis committee, they have all that information to be able to help you drive through. I think that's the lead. And I think too many times they want to take somebody that was with a large company that, brought them from 100 million to 120 million or 150 million, whatever it is. That skill set is vastly different than the hand-to-hand combat of a startup where you're at zero.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. And the other thing which I want to discuss, and it's a question I get asked a lot, and it's when they're coming up to the cusp of commercialization, and they ask, what do we need first? Is it sales, clinical, market development? You've probably had a lot of time to think about this in different environments and different companies, and what do you think in that situation? Where would you be looking first?
Well, I mean, I mean, I think you need a commercial leader first, right? And person's going to help with marketing. You're going to build out your clinical team first. If you're still in trials, you haven't gotten approval yet because you need clinicals, depending on the product, right? If it's a mapping product or something where they're in the lab doing it, you need a clinical team first before you get approval, right? And then sales team goes in there. What I've always loved is, and we did this at Atraverse, my first hire was sort of a clinical based individual that had tremendous amount of raw sales talent that had never been developed because didn't have the opportunities at her current company, or her past company rather. And so we brought her in to be able to kind of help launch account, show us the clinical ways with a pathway to sales. And she's done amazing. That her path was clinical. So if you've got a sales rep that can't cover cases in this small environment, you failed. They have to be able to do both.
Okay. And when it comes to that development, what is the absolute platinum grade? What is something that you look at in any salesperson that you want to find within them?
I just want to see how inquisitive are they, right? What questions do they ask? Are they afraid to ask questions? Like, Doc, I saw you did this, this, this. Any particular reason why? Right. And I think some clinical folks, they think I'm destined to be a clinical forever because that's just where they're at. And they just see that salesperson as that used car salesman, like, hey, what's it going to take to get you in this car today? And I think they don't realize that, questions really sell more than telling, right? Because if you're telling, you're not selling, right? I think that was Al Kepler said that to me many years ago at Guidant. Because I had a tendency to be very verbose, probably like I am today. But he's like, look, if you're constantly telling, you're not selling. And so questions really make the physician or administrator really answer and control the conversation and tell you exactly where you need to go next.
Okay. And I now I want to just talk about the scale of, like, you've seen the biggest commercial organizations in the world, you've seen the smallest ones, you've seen, the good, the bad, you've seen chaos at both ends of the spectrum. What about these moments, in these individual moments, whether it's product recalls, acquisitions, what is it that really teaches you as a commercial leader?
Yeah. So, I mean, everybody's had rough moments in their careers, whether, to your point, product recalls or whatever else. And the leaders around you help shape you in your future. And I got to be honest, I've learned way more from bad leadership than I have good leaders. And what do I mean by that is good leaders, you don't realize how good they are until you've had a bad leader. And so, what I look for in leadership, or what I try to portray to my folks, and what I'm asking for my leaders underneath me, is calm under pressure, ability to not react to a situation, sort of get the information first, and then let's get a course of action and go. I think bad leadership, they see like, oh, we've had our 27th recall in a row, like Guidant, and they hang their heads versus, and they hide, right? When times get tough, a lot of leaders I've seen in my career hide. That's when you need to be most visible to your team and communicate the most, so they know they're not in it alone.
And how do you communicate that? So when, anyone in an environment like that, they've probably got heightened senses to these kind of things. They probably know something serious is happening, but maybe not so how much serious it is. How do you actually communicate that and portray that properly so that you can, balance everyone out and not let the ship sink?
Yeah, I mean, I think whatever that communication is, whether it's email, text, but I think the best is put on a call, get everybody in a room, and go, and just, talk to them, and then do this crazy thing, go out and deliver messages with your team, and be the one to take the beatings, right? Because, and I say that tongue in cheek a little bit, but when you're delivering a rough message to a customer, you're going to get the appropriate response, right? And if you're the one delivering it and you're taking it, and your team members right there, they're like, okay, I'm not in this alone. And I think that's one of the things some leaders fall short on, or I've had leaders that have fallen short on this in my career, where their tendency is when things get tough, they hide and they say, yeah, go do this. Let me know how that goes. And then you just don't hear from them. And that just doesn't work, especially when, tough times are tough. But you also want to hear from them when things are good. Celebrate your wins. You've got to celebrate your wins just as much as, take accountability for when we lose.
And do you think that accountability part comes into play with, you mentioned that you're very hands-on in your leadership. You like to still be out in the field and meeting customers and physicians and being side to side with the sales reps. Do you think that can maybe get lost in translation in bigger corporations when there is a more spreadsheet manager and people that aren't necessarily out there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's probably true, and that's honestly probably why I enjoy the startups, frankly, a little more than the big companies. Big companies have some great advantages, but I mean, if you truly want to develop your people, you can do that in a startup world where it's a much harder thing to do than in a big company. I'll give you an example. When I had 40 direct reports, and I had to do an individual development plan for each one of them. And all of them wanted to do, one of two things. They want to go into sales, they want to be in training, whatever the case may be. There's, a number of those clinicals, but there's only like 3 or 4 spots that they could all go to. And that was 3 or 4 spots that other regions were competing for as well. So there was no real development plan for them because there was nowhere to go. Whereas and they had to serve certain amount of time because the big companies want you to serve certain amount of times. Where startups, it's very much about what's your merit, what have you done, go get it. And I think that's where leadership can really impact a career much more, and the scalability and trajectory of a company by doing it. Now, what I also don't want you to take away from this, Jordan, is I'm a total micromanager. I'm not. I like to empower my folks and let them go. but you also want to be there for them.
There's a right balance there. I think the term micromanager gets thrown about quite a bit in vague details these days, and it can mean different things. I think if you're hands on with people and you're being supportive in the right way, that's just management for me. I don't think it's micromanagement in the sense, but I can see why you brought that up just to clarify with that. One thing I do want to ask you about.
For sure. I hate micromanagement, but that's another story.
Cool. One thing I do want to speak to you about, and it's because you've had the experience in this and in other companies in different areas of cardio as well. A lot of people lean on data, right? Clinical data is how they're going to attract early commercialization folk. I know that it's a bit of a two-way mirror. Some people believe it, some people don't. What's your thoughts on data and leaning into it too much at the start?
Well, I think to your point, EP has become such a crowded space with new products, right? And I think physicians are becoming overwhelmed with just the amount of new products. And so I think data becomes a huge guideline or guidepost for them. And most, at least in the what I'm hearing from physicians and administrators, they feel like a lot of the data is, you choose the criteria from which to enroll in. You choose the patients you want to go after, and then you say, "Oh, look, we had great data." Well, yeah, of course you did. You set the deck up in your favor. So I think randomized, controlled trials, larger scale trials, multi centers will be a lot of what future data is going to be that physicians really look to. Um, I mean, it's always been a little dirty secret, like, oh yeah, we're, in left-handed people named Larry, we have 1,000% success rate, and they're amazing, and they're doing great 5 years after. But I think they're looking for larger data sets, to doing different things to change, how they bring in products. In it's getting much harder, um, and there has to be an economic value.
That makes sense. And do you think founders sometimes confuse clinical validation with commercial adoption? Do you think they see them as swing?
100%. I mean, I've talked to several companies that have inquired about consulting, and they're saying, like, our data sells itself. We really don't. And the projections they did, I was like, there is no way you're getting this, because you're forgetting you're fighting against well established big footprints, Biosense, Medtronic, Abbott, Boston. Um, these folks have a presence. And they're like, yeah, but Boston was able to do it. I'm like, they were the only one on the market at that time, because, Pulse Select was, they had issues with manufacturing, and just that rollout didn't happen, right? Um, as it was supposed to. So Boston had a monopoly on the market for a while. And by the way, they were also already in those hospitals with CRM products and IC and, um, you know, endoscopy. So they had a presence in these hospitals and had, hey, let's just add an addendum to our contracts. So it was a very different animal than starting from scratch, where you have no footprint or anything else. And so I think some founders think that I've got this great product, we just drop it in and we're good.
So it's a bit naivety, can be a bit of a pitfall then. And so for the advice with people that genuinely have good data, how do you turn that into sales motion early on?
Sort of the why. What they've got. So the data is great. Paint a picture. Paint a picture of the patient when you're getting ready to sell it, because data is one thing, but it doesn't feel like anything. If you could say, imagine this patient. You just saw this patient in your lab. Da 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 da. What do you do for them? Well, it shows on the data that XYZ product is going to treat them better, and you're not going to see them back, or you're going to extend their life. Whatever the case may be, always bring it back to a patient. One of the things Pfizer taught long ago when I was a drug pusher, much to my parents' chagrin, was it takes somebody on average 9 times to hear a message for them to process it and be able to regurgitate it back to you. When you develop that patient in their mind, I think it resonates a lot more than 7,666 patients did much better on XYZ. right? Bring it back to Sally or Jim or Jose or whoever.
So yeah, you've got to paint that image for them. And I think that's the same. Talk about this a lot when you're raising capital as well. Like there's got to be that human aspect of it. They've got to feel it and they've got to understand that it's got to hit home for them. So you make a very valid point there. I think there's a couple of questions I wanted to round off with today. And um, one of the things for me is you touched on this. A lot of the founders that we speak to that might be listening to this, they've got brilliant technology, but a lot of them are engineers, they're scientific people that have created brilliant technology, but they still don't know about how they're going to implement it and get it out there to the space. What do you think they need to understand about commercialization before they start hiring, raising, and even thinking about selling these devices?
It's going to be way harder than they think it's going to be. And it's going to take way more money than they think it's going to be. So when they're raising money, add to it. Good people cost more. You can fill out a field team with very inexperienced, very cheap people, and you will be ineffective compared to having half those people that actually know what's going on. And so I think, you know, some founders fall in love with their product as well. They think there's nothing wrong with it. And you have to be honest about deficiencies that you may have in your product and either address them or try to fix them as well.
I like that. I think a lot of people are precious about stepping out of their roles as well and finding replacements for themselves when it comes to that stage, and it can be a pitfall for them. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and you alluded to this a bit earlier, and it's one of the most common themes that we're noticing right now, is companies wanting to know how to unlock talent from the big four. What is genuinely going to turn the head of someone that's doing incredible at one of the big corps?
Great question. I've had to scale outside of just the folks that I've known. So I look for folks that want opportunity. We talked about before where, I was doing performance development plans for 40 people and there might have been one spot that comes available every other year or something, right? So give them the opportunity of where they can go. Um, but it's like, you have to look at what they're doing now. So you have to ask a lot more questions like, what are you doing in addition to your current job? What additional responsibilities have you taken on? What are you doing to develop yourself currently? So are they reading books to, figure out, sales or leadership or whatever the case may be? And you'll be shocked that some of the people will tell you, oh, I read these books. One of them turned me on to Blinkist. I spend so much time in my car. I'm not affiliated with Blinkist, but it's one of these ones where you can go in and they'll take a business book or any book actually and boil it down to like 15, 20 minutes audio and just giving you the top points. So one of them turned me on to that. So I've been using that for a number of years now. But those are the folks you see that they're investing in themselves. They want to do something. Those are the ones you start to give a shot versus the ones that are like, oh, last thing I read was on Instagram. It was awesome. I read a bunch every night. So
So I think what you mean by that as well then is like peeling back the onion, really understanding what gets someone emotionally going, physically going, what's going to attract them and keep them and retain them at a business, rather than necessarily just looking at, what you see on surface level.
100%. And you ask them like, where's your next stop at, let's say Medtronic or Abbott or J&J or Boston, whatever. And if they're like, yeah, I really don't have an opportunity here, or they think at sales, like, great, when do you think you can get that?
I'm going to
Those
go ahead.
it's years, and they're talking about years. And then, you just talk about different things and say, well, if you want to have an opportunity, we have some here.
I'm going to steal something you just asked, and it's my final question of today's episode. What's next for you? What do you want next?
That's a great question. My wife's asking me the same question. Oh,
Sick of you being around the house for now.
yeah, I've been I think she's ready for me to start traveling a little more, but that's another story. Now I purposely took some time after the acquisition. Was fortunate that I can. I started the consulting company because I just wanted to not get stale. Next, I'm not 100% sure. I'm sure I'll get back into med tech, but I'm trying to take a little breather for a minute. I mean, we ran hard at Atraverse. We ran hard. The last 18 months was, as I have told reps that have never traveled before and they're excited about it, I'm like, look, best day of your career is when you get status on everything. Second best day of your career is when you lose status on everything. So I actually have enjoyed not being on a plane for the last little bit. We did go to the mountains, so I did have to get on a plane, but that was with the family. And as my wife says, I'm probably the worst traveler of all of us. And I'm like, that might be because I'm the pack mule carrying all the stuff, but that's for another show. But no, I think I'll get back into medtech. I have a feeling John's got some things cooking. I'll probably, maybe do something there. I've got some consulting that I've pushed off for a little bit, and I've started. I'm consulting already for one company, and that may lead into some full time. But I'm enjoying what I'm doing right now. I'm enjoying spending some time with the family. One of the things that your founders and others that listen to this, probably a lot like me, you work-life balance is in stages, right? So I've put a tremendous amount of work in for a long time, and I'm taking a month or two and just see what it looks like, because I've definitely neglected some stuff around the house I need to do, and I have a list. So what I'm actually going to be doing over the next little bit, Jordan, is I've got to check off a laundry list of stuff Wendy needs me to do around the house. Like I've got some stucco repair outside. I got some drywall stuff. I got to paint a few rooms. So I'm going to be needing to come back to work because I don't know that I can do all the stuff around the house that needs to be done.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, Brandon, and hopefully more podcasts while you've got some free time as well. It's been great speaking with you. And so, yeah, I just wanted to round things off there, and thank you very much for joining us on the show.
I really appreciate the opportunity. This is my first, so thanks. I appreciate it, and excited to see what else comes from this. So thank you.
My pleasure, Brandon. Take care.
Take care, Jordan.
Thanks for listening to The Crux of Cardio. If there's one thing this space has taught me, both personally and professionally, is that progress in cardiovascular care is never the result of one individual. It's built by ecosystems, by teams, by people willing to take the long bets on hard problems. At Crux, our mission is to support that ecosystem through talent, capital, and community. The podcast is one small part of that effort, a place to share the real stories from people shaping the future of cardiovascular care. If you found value in today's conversation, I would love for you to follow the show and share it with someone building in this space. And if you're a founder, operator, or investor working on something meaningful in the cardiovascular care space, we'd love to hear from you.